Hi everyone, I'm Congressman Jared Huffman. Thanks for joining me at this year's Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and thanks to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for your creativity and hard work to organize this virtual event. I hope this finds everyone healthy and well, and although we're facing ongoing and unprecedented challenges, I'm pleased to see communities all across the country stepping up and continuing their important work, fighting for our oceans and the biodiversity that supports ecosystems, economies, and our country's rich ocean and coastal heritage. I have the pleasure of representing the North Coast of California. My district spans 1/3, and I'd argue the most beautiful third, of California's coastline. On the North Coast, coastal ecosystems are critical for local economies that depend on fishing, tourism, recreation, and other ocean-based businesses. We've experienced the consequences of a changing ocean, which has led to fishery disasters and the decimation of our once thriving kelp forests. Biodiversity and healthy oceans are critical to livelihoods and the way of life in my district, just as they are for all coastal districts. Now, our country has an important tool to protect ocean biodiversity: the National Marine Sanctuaries. One of my most memorable experiences working with the sanctuaries was in 2014, when I stood with then House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi and 15 other members of the California delegation to support the expansion of the Gulf of the Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries. A year later, we celebrated the expansion, which was a culmination of a decades-long effort by environmental, industry, and community leaders. As chair of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee, I've led and advanced policies to support our coastal communities and balance meaningful protections with sustainable use and community input. I've made it a point to highlight the impacts of climate change on our oceans, to hear from scientific experts with diverse stakeholders chiming in, and to try to work with my colleagues across the aisle whenever possible. It's critical now more than ever that we work together to protect the ocean resources that support communities around this country. So today, let's celebrate what we've accomplished and focus on continuing this important work for a future of healthy oceans. Thank you again, and enjoy the event.
Aloha, and a special mahalo to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for hosting Ocean Week and allowing me to join in our goal to truly care for and nurture our Earth, or as we say in Hawaii, to malama aina. I would like to especially recognize Hawaii's own Brian Neilson, who is sitting on the Power of Protection panel. He is a committed partner, widely known and admired for his work with aquatic resources with our State Department of Land and Natural Resources. As we assemble again, our world's precious oceans continue in mortal danger. From climate change and ocean warming to non-point source pollution, trash, overfishing, and beyond, they are on an unsustainable path and desperately need a truly international consensus and effort to save them. From past millennia, the ancient Hawaiians and their brothers and sisters throughout the Pacific offer a way forward. For the native Hawaiians, wise, consistent, long-term sustainable stewardship of their natural resources was not just a nice to have, not just a moral obligation to the earth, it was about their very survival. The Hawaiians managed their resources through the ahupua'a system, under which their resources were managed by individual land divisions that stretched from the top of the mountains out into the fisheries of the ocean. Each ahupua'a had the resources of life, and each was managed to sustain those resources over the generations. These ahupua'a also recognized that some areas needed to be off limits to extraction because they were key to the overall balance and regeneration of life. In the best of our modern world, where we have forged the best hope for the survival and health of our world's oceans, we have followed these lessons. A prime one exists in the waters of the Hawaiian Islands. In December of 2000, President Clinton signed into law the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Coral Reef Ecosystem Reserve, protecting one of the most pristine and ecologically invaluable marine ecosystems in the world. And 6 years later, President George W. Bush overlaid and strengthened that reserve with the creation of the largest marine national monument in our country, which our Hawaiian kupuna, or elders, later named Papahanaumokuakea. In doing so, these two presidents recognized that wise stewardship of our oceans requires both sustainable extraction for some portions, but also virtually no extraction and broad protections for others. In this way, would we not just preserve some of our natural environment as close to its pristine state as possible, but assure safe places where the web of life could truly be protected and regenerate for the benefit of all resources? That monument today lies under the protection of various entities, including our State Office of Hawaiian Affairs, maintaining the voice of our indigenous communities in its stewardship. This year, Ocean Week is about protecting biodiversity and building a sustainable global economy. I would like to highlight one initiative that is right up this alley. Just last month, fellow-minded colleagues on both sides of the aisle and I introduced a measure that seeks to protect and preserve a delicate and endangered resource, our coral reefs, here and around the world. The Bipartisan Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act aims to continue, update, and improve our national commitment to save our endangered coral reefs. That was a commitment made by our country when the law was first enacted by Congress back in 2000. In the 2 decades since, the state of our reefs has deteriorated alarmingly, and the challenges and opportunities for effective management have evolved. I hope you will join my colleagues and me in supporting this critical measure, which is all about both biodiversity and sustainable and renewable use of our marine resources. Please know that I stand with you fully today to remain vigilant and aggressively protect, preserve, and enhance the most precious natural resource on our planet, our oceans. Aloha and best wishes for a most successful event.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sean Cosgrove, Program Officer with the Marine Conservation Initiative at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. I'll be the moderator today for a panel that dives into one of the most pressing needs for sustainable ocean management, the need to permanently protect ocean and coastal habitat. The Moore Foundation is pleased to be a supporter, once again, of Capitol Hill Oceans Week, and so I welcome you all to learn about the Moore Foundation at moore.org. Our panel today is titled The Power of Protection. We have a tremendous panel of experts to help us dive into one of the most pressing needs in ocean management. Joining us today are Mark Spalding of the Ocean Foundation, Jenn Eckerle, Deputy Director of the California Ocean Protection Council, Dr. Ruth Perry, Marine Science and Regulatory Policy Specialist with Shell Upstream Americas, and Brian Neilson, who's the Administrator of the Department of Land and Nature Resources, Division of Aquatic Resources. First, we're going to start out with a presentation by each one of our panelists, providing their background and their connection to this work. Mark, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here. The Ocean Foundation also is a proud supporter of CHOW for many years, and it's been great to do this. I'm the president of the Ocean Foundation. We are a community foundation for the ocean based in Washington, D.C. We have projects or grantees on 7 continents and 40 countries, and over the last 17 years have spent about $30 million on habitat protection. I want to tell you just about one project today. Some marine protected areas are de facto and some are de jure. Some designed for animals protect key habitat. For example, whale sanctuaries are usually set up to protect their breeding and calving or their feeding grounds. But what about getting from here to there? Our 2 Corridors project, in partnership with the International Fund for Animal Welfare and the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University, is designed to expand protections for baleen or great whales in order to protect them along their migratory routes on both coasts of North and South America, including the Caribbean. The project will engage lawmakers in coastal countries along the migratory routes to improve protections and ensure safe passage for baleen whales. We began working on the 2 Corridors concept because the migratory movements of marine mammals, and particularly baleen whales, have often been overlooked in the creation of MPAs, even when established as marine mammal sanctuaries. While the creation of MPAs to protect biologically important habitats is incredibly valuable, what is missing is the protection between those critical areas along the marine animals' migratory routes. Too little attention has been paid to the protection of these species throughout their range. As they move from the cool, productive feeding grounds of the poles to the breeding and calving areas of the tropics, these animals face many threats, including ship strikes, entanglement in fishing gear, pollution, and harassments. Our Two Corridors project focuses on the protection of baleen whale species that migrate through the waters of Western Hemisphere nations, including blue whales, gray whales, humpbacks, North Atlantic right whales, and southern right whales. The timing and routes of these whales' migrations are increasingly well understood, as are the threats that they face as they migrate. The migratory corridors between the places where whales feed and where they breed and calve are important to whale survival in their own right and require improved legal and regulatory protection of national waters within these corridors. We will apply a comprehensive legal analysis to assess existing laws protecting baleen whales in national waters as well as in each nation's EEZ. Existing laws will be benchmarked against the United States Best-in-Class Marine Mammal Protection Act. We will rate each country within the project's geographic scope as falling within one of 4 categories: a gold, silver, bronze level, and then a red card for those who have no protections at all. We are using geospatial technology and mapping to improve policymakers' understanding of threats to great whales and the need to protect them throughout their range. The resulting map will show a layer with vital migratory corridors, a second layer with particular threats along those pathways, and then our third layer with existing national and legal and regulatory protections. These 3 layers have never been mapped together before. This assessment and rating will establish a visual baseline of protections and identify gaps in protection along migration corridors, especially where the threats exist. After we layer the maps with this information, the next phase will be to identify 5 target countries to improve protections for the whales through legislation, moving them from a lower to a higher standard, say from bronze to silver. To protect them, we will undertake a receptivity analysis to select the countries. We will undertake a receptivity analysis by assessing each country's anticipated willingness, ability, and capacity to implement and comply with new legislation, as well as considerations for connectivity to other protected areas. We will communicate the information to decision makers in countries with inadequate protections for whales, help them understand why it's imperative to protect whales, and finally help raise public awareness and support for improved protections for great whales. Our coalition will engage key decision makers in target countries to encourage introduction of legislation to improve protections for whales in their country's waters. All of this with the goal of providing whales with safe passage to their nursery areas and back again with their young to their feeding grounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We appreciate that. I'm going to go next to Dr. Ruth Perry of Shell.
Great, thank you, Sean, and thank you to my fellow panelists in Capitol Hill Ocean Week for having me back. I do always love to speak at this event and try to bring in an energy perspective into these conversations. And I think this one is of particular importance given that there's a big milestone happening in the Gulf of Mexico right now around the expansion of the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, which happens to be one of the U.S. healthy coral systems in the middle of a blooming and rapidly expanding blue economy in the Gulf of Mexico. So just to give you a little intro on my background, I'm a marine scientist. I've been working in the Gulf of Mexico for about 15 years in a number of different topic areas, from hypoxia to marine mammals to ocean observing systems. And I've been with Shell as a marine scientist and policy specialist for the last 6 years, working on how can we better utilize offshore energy infrastructure to monitor, protect, and strive toward coexistence in the blue economy, but also in the depths of the oceans that are most often hard for researchers and scientists and conservationists to reach, but are areas of the oceans that we work in every day. And we work in a kind of a range of different areas in the blue economy. And I was just going to run through a couple minutes of the different types of things we're doing and highlight a bit about the Flower Garden Banks, which I think is a unique opportunity given the timing of this panel. Just Shell as a whole, our footprint ranges across the broader Gulf of Mexico. So we really have a regional footprint from central Louisiana out to about 200 miles south, so just before the EEZ, all the way over to the Texas shelf. And we've been operating in deep water for the last 40 years, but have been in the offshore Gulf of Mexico for the last 60 years. We have a range and size of assets from offshore oil and gas structures to floating vessels to more of the traditional types of platforms. But as you get into the deeper water, the larger these platforms tend to grow. And a lot of these structures now are floating. They're not moored to the seafloor, but I just wanted to give you an economy of scale here, showing how we move these kind of things around as part of the blue economy and able to do that safely and responsibly. And then to give you something new that's for our company is the emergence of renewable energy. So offshore wind is also another area that Shell is actively pursuing. And this is less so in the Gulf of Mexico, but more in the Northeast Atlantic. And also renewable energy is something that's being looked at the West Coast. So energy, I would say, is not as conventional as we think, but with the increase of renewable energy in the United States, there's a lot of other opportunities for coexistence between the energy industry, the conservation community, and the science community. There are a number of ways that Shell is collaborating to monitor the oceans, and I'll wait for my slide to pull up here. But one of those is advancing ocean technology and capability. So not only are we far into the EEZ and the Gulf of Mexico, we're also in very, very deep waters with our current asset being in 3,000 meters of water. And so we're monitoring that water column every day and utilizing new technologies to do so. Something that I know is top of mind for NOAA as well as the innovation community is how can we really expand our autonomous footprint to do monitoring for us. In the Gulf of Mexico since 2012, we've been working with the US Navy, NOAA, and a number of academic institutions, the University of Southern Mississippi and Texas A&M, to work together as an ocean observing community to improve hurricane forecasting, which is something very top of mind because now with Capitol Hill Ocean Week starting up, it's also the start of hurricane season. And so this is something very real for our community, and being able to work with government and academic scientists, we have to have the ability to evacuate people from our offshore platforms 2 to 3 days before storms hit the coast. So we're actually monitoring storms before they even get into the Gulf of Mexico. So out in the Caribbean, starting to make those calls so that we're able to shut down our infrastructure safely and get everybody the time they need to get home and move their families out of the path of storms. That also expands to opportunities that we can share offshore data from our platforms. So we do a number of different types of measurements around the oceans in our platforms, from biological observations with ROVs in the deep Gulf of Mexico, all the way up to real-time currents, temperatures, and winds. So we're working with NOAA very closely to set up some data sharing that allows all of this information we're collecting on the platforms to be utilized in real time. And then one of the projects that I'm really excited that we're starting to look at with the National Academy's Gulf Research Program is even using offshore platforms as installation for new equipment, such as high frequency radars, so that we can get surface currents all the way further out in the Gulf of Mexico beyond the traditional observing equipment like HF radars that is based in the coast. And then we try to incorporate all of this into education, outreach, and communications, because it's very important to connect the communities of the areas that we work in, being that we have over 10,000 people in Louisiana alone, their families, to understand why the oceans are important, not only for energy production, but the different resources that the oceans provide. And I like to show this because part of the work with the offshore energy industry to do that safely means that we're monitoring and exploring the oceans ourselves to ensure that any of the footprint we have is not leaving a lasting impact. And so more than often, there's been cases in the Gulf of Mexico where our survey work has led to exploration. And I think this is another great opportunity that can exist between the academic, the conservation, and the government communities that are all trying to protect and monitor resources to really understand what's out there, and then how do we work together to conserve those resources. Which this mapping is in the deep sea that's more focused on a historical shipwreck, but coming back to the Flower Gardens expansion, a lot of the work that we do is mapping our lease areas. Those mappings lead to the identification of sensitive habitats that we work around during our operations and that we protect and monitor those during our operations, and even leads to the discovery of new species, including a lot of the deep sea coral communities that exist in the Gulf of Mexico. And so I just wanted to hit, I know we'll get more into this, Sean, but the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary is a true example of conservation working together with the energy industry, the fishing community, the academic community, the NGO community, to work together since 2012 to develop and propose an expansion of a sanctuary. And this is very exciting for us because given that it's a great example of how coexistence, working together to conduct science, to conduct monitoring and exploration, can lead to significant conservation efforts. So I want to point this out, and I hope we'll have a little bit more time to go into it, because I think it's important for our audience to know it's an active sanctuary process and they can be involved. And just to give everybody a point of reference for the Flower Gardens, it's located off the Texas shelf, Texas and Louisiana shelf. It's pretty far out. It's not a traditional coral community like you see in Florida. That's close. It's a deep water coral community, and it expands across the shelf. And so this expansion is nearly going to double the Flower Gardens in its size to up to 160 square miles. And again, this coral community, the reefs and the banks, have been coexisting with all the different U.S. blue economy resources in the Gulf of Mexico, which is one of the highest activity regions and the 7th largest economy in the world. So I'll leave it with that, Sean, and thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. That's fascinating. We're definitely going to come back to Flower Gardens, as well as some of the amazing technology that and data usage that Shell has. Let's go now to Jenn Eckerle. She's the Deputy Director at the California Ocean Protection Council. Jenn?
Thank you, Sean. Okay, thank you so much. My name is Jenn Eckerle, and I'm the Deputy Director of the California Ocean Protection Council, or OPC. I'm really pleased to be here and looking forward to the panel discussion later today. So OPC is a cabinet level state agency that works to protect the coast and ocean by advancing science-based policy and management and catalyzing action through funding and partnerships. We also serve as the state's policy lead on MPAs. And prior to working at OPC, I worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I helped design the marine protected areas in Southern California. There's much to share about California's MPA experience. We have our landmark legislation, the Marine Life Protection Act, that required the state to reevaluate existing protected areas and create new ones. The innovative funding between the state and philanthropy that allowed the planning effort to succeed after 2 failed attempts. Scientific guidelines that provided guardrails to ensure MPAs conveyed ecological benefits, and ocean stakeholders with a seat at the table, tasked with working together to draw lines on a map. As a result, California has 124 ecologically connected MPAs covering 16% of state waters, the largest science-based network in the US and one of the largest in the world. Our network is safeguarding California's rich marine biodiversity for the ecological, economic, and intrinsic benefits that it provides. And we're already seeing positive results in some of California's older MPAs with bigger and more abundant fish inside versus outside MPA boundaries. But I want to take my time now to convey one message, and that is that the success of California's MPAs rests on a foundation of strong partnerships partnerships between government agencies, scientists, tribes, nonprofits, fishermen, members of the community, and private donors. And these partnerships are really critical in leveraging resources and expertise and are driving integrated action that is greater than the sum of its parts. So I'm going to share two examples of the partnerships that are helping support MPA implementation in California. The first is the MPA statewide leadership team. So there are 3 agencies that have legislative mandates and lead responsibility associated with creating or managing California's MPAs: the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the California Fish and Game Commission, and the OPC. But embedding MPAs more significantly into California's ocean governance is being advanced through a leadership team that's made up of members from 15 different organizations representing state and federal government, tribes, local community experts, and philanthropy who are working together to successfully implement the state's MPA management program. This leadership team provides a venue for communication, ensures shared awareness of issues that could impact MPA resources, and a coordinated and consistent approach to addressing these issues. And members of this multi-organizational partnership have signed a formal agreement to committing to ongoing collaboration. Our second example is the state's improved partnership with tribes. The Marine Life Protection Act was silent on tribal rights, practices, and indigenous ecological knowledge. Failure to recognize the centuries-long stewardship of coastal resources by California Indian tribes was a terrible oversight that resulted in strong initial opposition to the creation of MPAs in Northern California. Significant work was necessary to overcome this oversight, but the state has made progress to improve engagement and partnership with tribes. I'm proud to share that on June 19th, the Ocean Protection Council will consider funding a pilot project called the Tribal Marine Stewards Network, which will be launched in partnership with 4 North Coast tribes and will enhance tribal capacity to monitor and manage their ancestral lands while providing the state with critical information necessary to inform MPA management. So where do we go now? California's first adaptive management review of our MPA network is coming up in 2022. Long-term monitoring is underway and will help provide an understanding of MPA performance in meeting the goals of the Marine Life Protection Act. But we are also looking ahead to understand whether California's MPAs are conferring resilience benefits and can provide a potential insurance policy against climate-driven change in the ocean. To further elevate California as the global model for marine conservation, we are in the process of adding our MPAs to the IUCN Green List of protected and conserved areas. This is the first network that will be evaluated against Green List criteria. And we're also examining the potential to increase protection across the West Coast, aspiring to have an ecologically connected network that extends from British Columbia all the way to Baja, Mexico. As we collectively strive to achieve the 30 by 30 target to protect at least 30% of the global ocean in 2030 in highly protected areas, we must work together to share information, identify opportunities for collaboration, and inspire action to increase ocean conservation around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. That was outstanding. We're definitely going to come back and talk about tribal partnerships and other important components of stakeholder involvement. Last, definitely not least, Brian Neilson, who's Administrator, Department of Land and Nature Resources at the Division of Aquatic Resources for the wonderful state of Hawaii. Brian, tell us about your work, please.
Hi, Sean and fellow panelists, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in Capitol Hill Ocean Week. I'm Brian Neilson. I'm the administrator of the Division of Aquatic Resources. We are the lead agency in managing aquatic resources in state waters in Hawaii, a large portion of which are marine areas and our coral reefs. And I'll be providing a little overview of our marine protected areas and marine managed areas in Hawaii. Okay. Right, we have the largest concentration of coral reefs in Hawaii. with more than 7,000 known species of animals and plants and over 1,200 unique species. Our marine areas and reefs are incredibly important to Hawaii in terms of our economy, our society, our ecology, and governance, and provides huge economic value. Our coral reefs are valued at over $360 million a year in terms of the dollars brought in through our tour industry for dive and snorkeling tours and whale watching tours. Our nearshore fisheries are valued at over $10 to $16 million a year, and are a huge source of local food production, providing 7 million meals per year, and also provide incredible value in terms of shoreline protection. Our living reefs dissipate the majority of wave energy during storm events and hurricanes and keep those waves crashing offshore instead of onshore onto our roads, our homes, and our schools and businesses, and provide an estimated $835 million in value to our economy. And our reefs and ocean waters are incredibly important to our culture and way of life in Hawaii. It's who we are and it's what we are. But our reefs are facing incredible challenges, especially in light of climate change, and we're really seeing this in the last several years. We've faced 3 major coral bleaching events in the last 5 years in Hawaii, and scientists are predicting that this will be the new norm. So we're incredibly scared that we'll be losing corals at a much faster rate that we're gaining them. And while we're trying to manage this challenge, we're also still trying to manage decade-long issues in terms of depleted fisheries, pollution, and invasive species. And marine managed areas, marine protected areas have been identified as a key management tool to try to address some of these threats. So looking at marine protection in Hawaii, of course, we have the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument. It's actually celebrating its 15-year anniversary this year of establishment. This is the largest continuous marine protected area in the United States and co-managed by NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and State of Hawaii. It's located northwest of the main Hawaiian islands that we're most familiar with, and provides amazing ecological and historic importance. We also have our Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale Sanctuary. This was established in 1992 to protect humpback whales and co-managed by NOAA and the state of Hawaii, and provides research and education for conservation of humpback whales. But we're also looking to expand our network of marine managed areas in Hawaii, and we're doing this through Governor Ige's Sustainable Hawaii Initiative announced at the World Conservation Congress in 2016. And this initiative is the 30 by 30 Marine Management Initiative. And the goal is to the goal of this initiative is to establish 30% of nearshore marine waters as marine managed areas by the year 2030. And so just to give you an idea, we're at about 6% protection or marine managed area designation in nearshore waters in Hawaii right now. So we're looking to expand that out to 30% by 2030. And we are trying to do this in an integrative process, working with fishers, with Hawaiian leaders, and other stakeholders to plan and establish this network, integrating traditional knowledge, science, and local expertise into the planning process. One of the unique types of marine managed areas in Hawaii is the community-based subsistence fisheries area. These are typically grassroots movements by Hawaiian communities who establish management plans and rules and regulations for their areas. They work with their communities to build consensus and really participate in the management of their area in collaboration with state managers. So these management plans and rules are actually turned into state law, and they often employ many of the Hawaiian traditions and techniques that were established centuries ago in terms of selecting seasonal fisheries closures or no take of certain species, year restrictions, and then also the monitoring techniques. And this is a major component of achieving the 30 by 30 initiative moving forward. And with that, thanks a lot.
Outstanding. Thank you, Brian. Hey, why don't we go ahead and dive into some questions here. Brian, I'm going to start with you. That has, you had a lot of great information there on the process by the state of Hawaii. If I understood you correctly, there's 7,000 species identified in Hawaii coral reefs, 1,200 which are specific to Hawaiian waters, right, endemic. When Hawaii established this goal of 30 by 30, was it primarily for the need for biodiversity, species around coral reefs and others, or was there a number of different components for the reason for embarking on a goal like that?
Yeah, I think there was a number of different components. Of course, maintaining biodiversity was a huge part of that, but just looking at the economic value of our marine resources and what that biodiversity provides to the state of Hawaii, you know, can't be overlooked as well. So it's both ecological, it's subsistence and making sure that people have food on the table, but also tremendous economic value in terms of a tourist-based economy here in Hawaii.
Outstanding. Okay, so the process that the state's identified for going through, your agency is going through, where does it start at? Does it start at public engagement? Does it start with gathering traditional knowledge, science, and data? Where does it, or are those things basically occurring at the same time? How'd you start on this work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we've been trying to figure out how not to put the cart before the horse. And so we've been really looking towards California, and I'm sure Jenn could speak to this in terms of their process, but we definitely don't want the science to get too ahead of working with Hawaiian communities and stakeholders. So we've been trying to do it all at the same time, just so we don't prioritize scientific planning over the traditional knowledge and expertise, or going out and asking people, what are the issues in your areas? What are some tools? What are some management tools that can fix those issues? So we've been trying to do it all at the same time, which hasn't been the quickest process, but we do feel like that's a way to kind of not leave people behind, but also keep the process science informed.
Outstanding. So Jenn, sounds like you're cute. You were involved in the original process for developing the Marine Life Protection Act protected areas, right? And now the state is doing a review, kind of assessment of performance. All right, so where are you going now with your review? How are you incorporating new data into that? And what's the stakeholder process and priorities for California? Three very small issues right there together. Go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, so California, the 10-year anniversary of the full network being completed is in 2022. And so the state has a requirement to do a decadal adaptive management review. And so that 2022 will be our first one. We have collected, prior to the MPAs going into place, we had baseline data to understand kind of where things were ecologically before the boundaries went in. And then we've been funding and conducting long-term monitoring since then. The adaptive management review is going to kind of incorporate all of that data to understand kind of the ecological trends. We're going to look a bit at the socioeconomics, the recreational and educational uses, basically integrating the 4 components of California's MPA management program. And that includes outreach and education, research and monitoring, enforcement and compliance, and permitting and policy. And so we're working really closely with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who is the managing agency and responsible for pulling that review together. And that review will be provided to the Fish and Game Commission, who has ultimate regulatory authority to consider whether to make any adaptive changes to the Marine Protected Area Network. So right now we have a scientific advisory group who's helping us shape what that analysis will look like, because we've got individual researchers looking at a variety of habitats across the state, and that will provide one kind of level of information. But how do we integrate that data in a way that tells a story across the network? So that effort is underway, and that will feed into the long-term, the adaptive management review. So I think you asked another question about maybe what's next, but I can't remember.
Well, let me ask you more directly. What's your timeline look like for your review, and any kind of decision coming out of that?
Yeah, so we anticipate that the review will be brought to the Fish and Game Commission in December of 2022. Because we are in a temperate ecosystem, and because the changes we anticipate from MPAs will likely take, closer to 15 or 20 years, we're not anticipating any recommendations at this time to change MPA boundaries, but we will expect to see recommendations identifying potential data gaps, so additional data needed to better understand the performance of MPAs, and again, thinking about how we better integrate the impacts of climate change and the pieces that were not folded in the beginning, the tribal piece that I talked about earlier.
Sure. Okay. Let me go to Dr. Perry. I want to talk about the Flower Garden Banks process in there, but I want to come back to both you, Jen, and we need to work Mark in here. I want to talk about whales, of course. Dr. Perry, you made a pretty strong statement about your commitment to Flower Garden Bank Sanctuary. I understand Shell's been involved in the process for a while. In some of your slides, at least two of your slides there, I think I saw some submersibles and a lot of other really interesting high-tech equipment. How do you use that? What does Shell use as far as their resources and capacities for gathering data, information, to inform the management plan development process? I heard a great statement at a public meeting, probably 12, 15 years ago. Science doesn't make the decision for us, but it certainly informs the decision, because stakeholders are a vital part of that. But with the capability that we have as a society now to gather better data and to be able to break it down and use it, we can make a lot better decisions. So tell us a little bit about what Shell does in Flower Garden Banks in that process.
Sure, thanks, Sean. That's a great question, and it's a broad question that I can talk to what Shell's specifically doing, but also I think what we've been trying to lead our industry counterparts at the table. The Flower Gardens has been pretty lucky as a sanctuary community. There's a lot of knowledge and awareness around the Flower Garden Banks in the Gulf of Mexico, so it's not an unknown area. It's not an easy accessible area, like if you were going to go down to the Florida Keys and snorkel, or in some of the places in Hawaii where you can access reefs from the shore. So it takes quite a bit to get out there. And to Jen's point and Brian's points earlier, it takes a lot of partnerships as well to make some of those things happen. From the Shell perspective, what we do, what you saw with the technology, is we're shifting towards a lot of autonomy, meaning that we can do high resolution seafloor surveys, bathymetry surveys using autonomous vehicles. So we're not out with the traditional large vessel mapping equipment, especially when you're getting to deep areas. So it's a lot of the same technology that you see on the Okeanos that NOAA's doing. And NOAA was actually recently in the Gulf of Mexico as well. So using that technology along with standard science and research, diving, doing your traditional biological surveys, combining all of these kind of techniques makes a really positive opportunity to what I think monitoring change. So not only being able to collect the baseline, but be able to monitor change without having to have people on the water, because the flower gardens aren't an easy area to get to. And so we need to take adaptive management, or what are some of the other tools and technologies that allow us to continue to monitor the health and vibrant reef areas. In my graduate work at Texas A&M, I did a lot of work at the flower garden banks around water quality. So given the Mississippi River and the Brazos River and a lot of changes that we're seeing in those two systems and what they're putting into the Gulf of Mexico was something that I worked on, and how some of that has impacted temporary coral bleachings, for instance. Brian talked about this. We've seen some significant bleaching events just due to the massive transportation of fresh water over the reef systems. So when you get 100 miles offshore and you're getting these massive lenses of fresh water, it creates a stratification, a two-layered system that prevents oxygen from the surface getting down to the reefs. And how do you be able to detect that early so that you can know the severity of those events and monitor it? We have to have real-time systems out at the flower garden banks. So whether those are buoys or autonomous vehicles like gliders, so we can monitor the changes in the system and be able to predict what's going to happen to those banks. And that allows the sanctuary NOAA staff to be able to respond accordingly. So trying to really condense timelines, technology allows us the ability to do that. And then I think my fellow panelists talked about climate change. That's been a top of mind issue for Gulf of Mexico, including the oil and gas industry, but a lot of the scientists we work with, is what's happening not only in the surface waters and shallow environments, but deeper waters and those deeper layers that are of oxygen saturation that's moving through the Gulf of Mexico. How is that going to impact shallower systems such as the reefs? And so we partnered together with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management about 5 years ago to put in a real-time ocean acidification system at the flower garden banks. To not only look at the real-time measurements, but be able to correlate present-day activities that we're seeing, such as what I referenced with freshwater discharge after a storm coming out of a river system, which is going to put a temporary impact on the flower garden banks and a temporary stressor. Combine that with some of the climate records in terms of looking at coral changes over history by looking at the changes in the carbonate of the corals themselves, right? So how do you combine the present day with the longer term series? And again, that is the adaptation of technology, utilizing that technology, but also utilizing partnerships where we can enable the scientists that need to get out to those banks to do so, provide the technology that provides sustainable time series, and increase the longevity of observations, and then take all of that information and synthesize it into executing a management plan and an adaptive management plan for the sanctuary, and keep it healthy, but also be able to understand what are the natural and anthropogenic impacts to that sanctuary. So it takes a lot of partners, and I think that's, you know, one of the points is everybody came around the flower gardens because it's in our backyard, and it's something that we want to see be sustainable and be a healthy ecosystem, because it not only is important to the reefs, but it's actually important to the large marine ecosystem in the Gulf of Mexico as well.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the depth of your response. So we have obviously national marine sanctuaries, a great system, I believe 13, and that includes 2 marine national monuments. We have areas in fishery management, which are called essential fish habitat. Sometimes that's just identification of areas. Sometimes it has some kind of management or conservation measure. The Coast Guard uses areas to be avoided so that ships don't end up on rocks or stuck in mud or basically cause public safety hazards, right? So Mark, if you're working on looking at the migration routes, the areas that baleen and other whales use, what do we call this kind of, which is going to be I would suspect to be a fairly large scale approach. What do we use as a legal mechanism, a design for a protected area for whales?
So this is why we're going to take the Marine Mammal Protection Act as our gold standard and see who else rises to that standard, who is below that standard, who is another step below that, and say, you know, this creates unintentionally a protected area for whales in US waters. If we can equate that in other nations' national waters and their EEZs, we can create equal protections against harassment, equal protections against entanglement and ship strikes and other things that cause harm to whales in US waters, in the waters of other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, so this would be all in US waters?
No, the
Or
whole
the high
idea here
seas?
is to, so the what we're doing is saying by passing the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we've created an artificial sanctuary for marine mammals throughout all of the US's waters. We didn't call it that, but it is de facto. And so the question is, how do we go through all the other countries in this hemisphere, our neighboring countries, countries in the Caribbean, countries in South America, where these whales migrate through their waters, and try and work towards getting protections that are equal to, as much as we can, what the United States has done with what we believe is the best in class protection in the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Okay, so you've had quite a bit of experience on the high seas. You're commissioner at the Sargasso Sea. Tell us briefly about what the Sargasso Sea is and kind of the approach there, the public trust doctrine, and maybe some other issues that arise there.
Sure thing, thank you. Covering about 2/3 of the North Atlantic Ocean and surrounded by a clockwise rotating set of currents with no land boundaries, lies the sort of unique 9 million square mile open ocean floating sargassum ecosystem known as the Sargasso Sea, identified by Christopher Columbus on one of his first crossings. It is, you know, predominantly high seas, this ecosystem. It is considered important for the life history of many species: eels, turtles, tuna, billfish, sharks. It was formally recognized in March 2014 via the Hamilton Declaration on the Collaboration for Conservation of the Sargasso Sea, which has now been signed by 10 nations who have agreed to collaborate. We've made the science case for conservation. We have begun to draft a stewardship plan to manage this special place and thus make it a role model for what a high seas marine protected area might look like. In fact, we put the Sargasso Sea and the Costa Rican Dome forward as BB&J, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, case studies during the 4th preparatory conference leading to the current negotiations on that topic. Sean, you also mentioned the public trust doctrine, and this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about with regard to marine protections and marine protected areas, and we're working on a book chapter. One of my, Alejandro Navarrete on my staff and I are writing a book chapter for the National Autonomous University in Mexico right now. MPAs are ocean places that belong to all of us and are held in the hands of our governments as public trust, so that common spaces and common resources are protected for all and for future generations. In other words, these places are common heritage of all mankind. We lawyers refer to this as the public trust doctrine, meaning that none of this is private property, nor should it be. Part of that is because we cannot anticipate all future needs, but we can know that our collective estate will be more valuable if we do not exploit it with short-sighted greed. We need governments to be responsible for these spaces on behalf of present and future generations, whether it's the examples we've heard about for the flower gardens in Texas, the MPAs in Hawaii, or those in California. These are assets to economic development when they are well designed and managed. Subsidizing MPAs is legal under international law, more so, for example, than, say, fishing subsidies are, and it would be a better return for each country and improve each country's food security. not to mention that there are many jobs created in the monitoring, enforcement, and restoration of MPA ecosystems. MPA should be sufficiently funded with public funds to accomplish what they were established to do. And it's because governments have the framework to plan beyond this generation and the next to truly protect such heritage and create an abiding legacy for all.
Thank you. All right, we have about a minute left. I'm going to ask Jen and Brian quickly. Hawaii's established a policy goal of protecting 30% of their state waters by 2030. There's a growing movement in the science, conservation, academic communities for a U.S. federal policy for 30 by 30. Brian, quickly, how do you see Hawaii fitting into a potential national framework for 30 by 30? And I'll ask you the same question, Jen. Brian, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great goal to join nationally. In Hawaii, we're hoping to exceed that 30% and effectively manage, the majority of our marine resources, if not all. But I think that would be a great goal for the whole nation, especially in light of the huge challenges that we're facing with climate change. We need to make some major management choices towards conservation if we're going to have any chance of dealing with some of the issues that are associated with climate change.
Thank you. Jen?
Yeah, I think that we also support this target for the nation and globally to protect 30% of our oceans in some type of protected area. And I think California is really standing at the ready right now to serve as a model for how you can do this in a way that's based in science and is really informed and driven by stakeholders and community members and culture and economics and ecology, so that we can integrate all of those pieces together and ensure that we're protecting that biodiversity and the habitat and the species that we all rely on.
Excellent. All right. I believe that brings us to the end of our time. Again, I want to thank you all. Mark Spalding, the Ocean Foundation, Jenn Eckerle with the State of California Ocean Protection Council, Brian Neilson with Hawaii's Department of Land and Wildlife. Is that correct? Land and Water?
Natural Resources.
Natural Resources. Good. I was testing you. You passed. And Dr. Ruth Perry of Shell Upstream Americas. You can find them all, their bios, in the materials that are associated with Capitol Hill Oceans Week. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today. I hope you learned something, and please stay in touch with this vitally important issue. In my estimation, protection of marine habitat is really one of the best things we can do to stave off the impacts of climate change, as well as its evil twin, ocean acidification. Because it helps to reduce other environmental stressors while we figure out the rest of what's going on. All right. Thank you all again. My name's Sean Cosgrove with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Enjoy the rest of your Capitol Hill Oceans Week.
Thanks, Sean. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.